long before the names Abu Dhabi or Dubai ever existed, before ports and palaces, before even the word emirate had meaning, this land was already alive. The Arabian Peninsula, vast and golden, stretched out beneath a blazing sun, carved by the slow hand of wind. Here, in what is now the United Arab Emirates, the first peoples wandered, leaving behind small footprints pressed into sand, now long blown away. The land was harsher then, yet it cradled life. Stone tools scattered in valleys and on the edges of ancient lakes tell us that more than 100,000 years ago, human beings walked across this ground. They followed rivers that no longer flow, hunted along shores that have since sunk beneath the Gulf's waters, and gathered in caves where the flicker of firelight would paint shadows against rough stone walls. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear them, the muffled strike of flint against rock, the distant call of early hunters across an open plain. In those times, the Arabian climate shifted often, sometimes wetter, with grassy plains where gazelles roamed, sometimes drier, where sandstorms swirled across the horizon. The people adapted, as they always have, moving with the seasons, carrying their memories in the rhythm of steps, in the telling of stories under starlit skies. As centuries passed, a new age arrived, the Bronze Age. With it came one of the most fascinating chapters of the UAE's earliest story. Around 2600 BCE, a culture known as Some al-Nar blossomed near what is today Abu Dhabi. Their settlements rose close to the sea, their lives tied to the rhythm of waves and trade winds. They built homes from stone and mud brick, circular in form, solid against the desert's breath. But what speaks most powerfully to us across millennia are their tombs, large, rounded structures built from carefully fitted stones, where entire communities would lay their dead to rest. These tombs still stand today on islands and in the sands, silent and enduring, shaped like giant beehives. Within them, archaeologists have found not just bones, but jewelry of carnelian, tools of bronze, and vessels painted with designs that echoed distant lands. For you see, even then, the people of this coast were not isolated. They looked outward to the sea, and the sea brought them connection. Boats from the Indus Valley, far across the waters, carried beads and pottery. Traders from Mesopotamia sought copper mined in nearby mountains, and in return they offered textiles, grains, and the mysteries of the wider world. Imagine the sight: wooden boats with square sails gliding over turquoise waters, the salty air carrying shouts of merchants, the gleam of newly forged bronze tools catching the sunlight. The UAE was already a crossroads, a place where cultures touched and mingled, where goods, ideas, and languages moved like waves. Even inland, life stirred with richness. The Hijar Mountains rose in jagged majesty. Hiding within them seams of copper that would be hammered and smelted. Glowing red in small clay furnaces, their smoke twisting into the desert air. Oases dotted the land, freshwater springs feeding groves of date palms whose sweet fruits sustained life then, as it still does today. The people learned to channel water through underground fly systems. Quiet channels cut into earth and stone, carrying the life-giving flow to fields. Listen closely, and you might hear it even now, the faint trickle beneath the soil, the rustle of palm fronds swaying against the wind. As centuries folded into centuries, the al-Nar culture gave way to new forms, new tribes, and new ways of building. Around 2000 BCE, the Wadi Suk culture took shape, marked by long, narrow tombs and a shift in trade. They began breeding camels, strong companions who could carry burdens across desert expanses, reshaping movement, reshaping life. Pearls, too, began to hold value in these times, the glistening treasures hidden in oysters beneath calm waters of the Gulf. Imagine the diver, lungs filled with a deep breath, slipping beneath the waves into cool silence, fingers searching the seabed, heart pounding with the mystery of what might be found within the shell. A tradition that would one day grow into one of the Gulf's greatest treasures had already begun its quiet, rhythmic pulse. The land of the Emirates was never empty, never silent. It was alive with traders, shepherds, seafarers, and storytellers. Each generation passed its knowledge to the next in the glow of firelight, as the stars wheeled endlessly overhead. The dunes shifted, but the people endured, carrying with them songs of the sea, wisdom of the desert, and dreams of the future. And so, as the first peoples gave way to the great ages of trade, the story of the UAE deepened, preparing for centuries of change still to come. As the centuries moved onward, the early peoples of the Emirates found themselves ever more entwined with the pulse of the wider world. The Arabian Gulf, with its glittering horizon and shifting tides, became a great highway of exchange. The waters that lapped softly against the sandy shores of Ras, Al-Khaimah, Sharjah, and Abu Dhabi were the same waters that carried sailors across to Mesopotamia, Persia, and the distant harbors of India. Imagine it, the creak of wooden hulls, the smell of tar and salt, the snap of canvas sails straining against the Gulf's steady winds. Boats rocked gently, filled with dates, wool, and precious copper from the Hajar Mountains, heading outwards. In return, they brought in spices, beads, silks, and stories from lands beyond sight. Trade was not merely a matter of survival. It was a way of life, an identity etched deep into the people of the Emirates. Markets would spring up near harbors, where baskets of dried fish lay beside coiled ropes. and merchants in long robes counted weights of frankincense and myrrh, whose scents carried far into the desert air. Frankincense, in particular, was treasured by civilizations far away. From the rugged southern mountains of Arabia, caravans moved north, bearing the fragrant resin that would one day burn in Egyptian temples, Roman villas, and sacred shrines across the Mediterranean. To walk among such caravans was to hear 1,000 languages, to smell the mingling of spices and smoke, to see fabrics dyed with colors brighter than any desert sunset. Yet, if there was one gift of the sea that defined the Emirates in this era, it was the pearl. Long before oil, before the glittering wealth of skyscrapers, pearls were the white gold of the Gulf. Generation after generation, men would row out in small wooden dhows, their hulls tarred black against the sun, their sails patched and billowing. On the deck, barefoot divers prepared themselves, pressing their hands together in ritual silence, with nothing but a nose clip of turtle shell and a basket tied to their waist. They would draw in one long, steady breath and then slip beneath the water. The sea closed around them like cool silk. Down they went, lungs burning, heartbeat echoing in their ears. Their fingers searched through sand and coral, grasping oysters, feeling their rough shells in the dim light. Sometimes they would find nothing. Sometimes, inside a small, unassuming shell, they would uncover a treasure round, smooth, glistening like the moon itself. Surfacing with a gasp, the diver would pass his basket to the hauler, and the rhythm of the sea continued. Dozens of dives in a single day, the cycle of descent and return, until the body ached with exhaustion. The pearling season was not just an economic pursuit, was a cultural heartbeat. Entire villages waited on its rhythm. Families sang songs to strengthen the spirits of divers. Poets composed verses about the sea's gifts and dangers. The Nahyan, the ship singer, would chant haunting melodies on deck, his voice carrying across the water, steadying the hearts of those who plunged into the depths. To the listener today, those songs might sound like lullabies of the sea itself, rising and falling like the tide, soothing yet filled with yearning. Pearls from the Gulf were prized across the ancient world. They adorned crowns in India, were strung into necklaces in Persia, and glittered in the courts of Rome. They carried with them the scent of the sea, the sweat of divers, and the prayers of their families. For centuries, the Emirate thrived on this trade, building networks that stretched far beyond their shores. But the story of trade was not only written upon the waves, it was carved into the sand by the long shadows of camel caravans. Camels, the great ships of the desert, carried frankincense, dates woven cloth, and pottery across the endless dunes. The desert routes where dangerous sandstorms could erase paths. Raiders could appear from the horizon, but the caravans endured. Their bells tinkling softly in the still air, their hooves pressing rhythms into the earth. To travel with a caravan was to live within an unbroken chain of movement. Sunrise setting the pace, noon demanding rest beneath the scarce shade. Night bringing the cool silence of stars brighter than any lamp. The people who guided these caravans, the Bedouins, developed a deep intimacy with the land. They read the sky like a map, knew the taste of water hidden in the earth, and measured distance by the rise and fall of dunes. Hospitality was their law, for in the desert, to refuse water to a stranger was to condemn him. A guest could always find a place near the fire. A cup of coabitter coffee brewed over glowing coals, and the low murmur of poetry carried in the night wind. This tradition, born of necessity, became one of the enduring treasures of Emirati culture, where generosity is woven into every welcome. As centuries layered upon centuries, the Emirates became a land defined by movement and exchange. Traders on boats, merchants in markets, poets in tents. Divers in the sea all carried within them the rhythm of life shaped by both desert and water. There was hardship, yes, but also resilience, beauty, and a quiet strength that whispered through every generation. And as the world shifted once more, another tide was preparing to sweep across these lands, the tide of a new faith, one that would forever transform the spiritual and cultural heart of Arabia. The desert was already ancient when the 7th century dawned. The dunes had shifted countless times, caravans had come and gone. The sea had yielded pearls and fish in endless rhythm. But something new was stirring in the heart of Arabia. In the city of Mecca, far to the west, a man named Muhammad began to speak of visions, of unity, of a single God. His voice, steady yet filled with light, carried beyond his city, beyond his tribe, beyond the mountains. Word spread slowly at first, carried on the tongues of traders, whispered in the gatherings of merchants who journeyed through markets and ports. Imagine the scene in the Emirates then. A small harbor village, its wooden boats drawn up on the sand, fishermen sorting their nets, merchants unrolling bolts of cloth. And into this marketplace comes the murmur of something different, something powerful, message of Islam. It did not arrive with soldiers, but with travelers. Men of the sea and of the desert who repeated what they had heard in Mecca and Medina. At first, it was only words carried on the air. But soon, these words became prayers, and prayers became communities. By the mid-7th century, emissaries of Islam had already reached the shores of the Gulf. Tribes across the Emirates embraced the new faith. Drawn to its clarity, its call for justice, its rhythm of prayer binding day to night, they built mosques of palm trunks and mud, simple yet profound, where voices rose together in the call to prayer, echoing across quiet villages. The first muezzins lifted their voices from minarets no taller than a man, yet their words stretched to the heavens. Allahu Akbar. The spread of Islam was not only spiritual but cultural, weaving new threads into the tapestry of daily life. Calligraphy bloomed, Arabic script curling like vines across parchment and wood. Poetry, once sung intense, now shaped into verses praising God, celebrating knowledge, urging compassion. The Quran became a living presence in households, its words recited by memory, its cadence lingering in the still night. And with faith came new ties of belonging. The tribes of the Amorites, once divided by lineage and rivalry, now found unity in shared belief. They became part of the great Islamic Caliphate, the Rashidun, then the Umayyads, then the Abbasid, that stretched across continents. Under these caliphates, trade flourished even more. For the Islamic world connected faraway lands. The spice ports of India, the markets of Persia, the silks of China, the libraries of Baghdad, the scholars of Damascus. The Emirates, small in size but rich in access to the Gulf, were swept into this grand current. The dhow boats now carried not just goods but pilgrims. Each year, men from the Emirates would journey westward to the holy city of Mecca for the Hajj, a pilgrimage binding them to Muslims everywhere. The pilgrimage routes linked people of the desert with Turks, Persians, Africans, and beyond. Imagine the sight of caravans meeting in the desert, strangers embracing as brothers, exchanging not just goods, but stories, wisdom, and news of distant lands. In these centuries, the coastlines of the Emirates began to bustle more vividly. Fishing villages grew into towns, their harbors dotted with masts. Dates, pearls, and fish were loaded into ships bound for Basra and Hormuz. Mosques rose quietly beside the sea, their courtyards filled with the scent of incense and the soft murmur of prayers. Tribal leaders now carried not only the authority of lineage, but the blessings of faith, guiding their people with the Quran as compass. But Islam brought more than unity and trade. It encouraged the pursuit of knowledge. Even in the humble settlements of the Emirates, children sat cross-legged before teachers, reciting verses, learning letters, grasping at the thread of literacy that tied them to a vast, interconnected civilization. Scholars and travelers passed through the Gulf, bringing tales of astronomical instruments that mapped the stars, medical texts translated from Greek into Arabic, philosophies debated in the grand courts of Baghdad. The people of the Emirate, though living in desert villages, were never isolated. They were nodes in this immense web of faith and culture. Yet, life remained as it always had balanced between land and sea. Bedouins still crossed the deserts with camels, guided by starlight. Fishermen still cast their nets into the shallows at dawn, their hands rough with salt. Pearl divers still braved the waves, their chants rising into the air. Only now, in the evenings, those same men would gather in mosques, their foreheads pressing to the ground in prayer, their hearts united in a rhythm that stretched from their village all the way to the distant centers of the Islamic world. There is something deeply calming in imagining those nights. The desert cooled under the sweep of stars. Fires glowed softly in clay braziers. Families gathered in circles, coffee brewing in copper pots, cardamom floating in the air. And at the heart of it all, the new faith offered a sense of belonging not just to a tribe, not just to a trade, but to something eternal, something vast. In time, the Emirates found themselves entangled in the shifting politics of the Islamic empires. Local rulers pledged loyalty to distant caliphs while also guarding their autonomy. Wars rumbled far away, but their echoes reached even these shores. Yet the Emirates endured, quiet and steady, carried forward by their faith, by their pearls, by their unbroken traditions. For nearly 1,000 years, the Islamic presence wove itself into every thread of Emirati life. By the medieval centuries, the small mosques had grown into larger centers of worship. Sufi mystics wandered across the deserts, sharing words of love and divine unity. Poets wrote verses that blended the imagery of sea and sand with devotion to God. And all the while, the Gulf continued to glimmer with pearls, luring traders from across the seas. But change was never far. As the world grew hungrier for spices and wealth, distant empires began to set their eyes upon the Gulf. Soon, sails unlike any seen before would appear on the horizon. The Portuguese were coming, and with them a storm that would alter the balance of the Gulf forever. The sea had long been a friend to the people of the Emirates. Its tides gave pearls, its winds carried merchants, its horizons promised connection. But in the early 16th century, a new presence appeared upon those waters, a presence unlike any the Gulf had ever known. From far across the seas, from the Atlantic coasts of Europe, came the Portuguese, driven by hunger for spices, for trade routes, for control of the oceans. Their ships were vast compared to the slender dhows, heavy galleons with high sterns, their sails thick and white, their sides pierced with rows of cannon. Imagine the fishermen of Sharjah or Ras Al Khaimah mending nets on a quiet morning, glancing toward the horizon and seeing such a vessel approaching. The dhows, familiar triangular sails, fluttered like birds. But these European ships loomed like floating fortresses, their flags snapping in the wind, their timbers creaking with the weight of guns and men. The Gulf, long a highway of commerce, was about to become a battlefield. The Portuguese came not only to trade, but to dominate. In 1507, the fierce commander Afonso de Albuquerque led fleets into the Arabian Gulf, capturing islands and fortresses. Their cannons thundered across waters that had known only the sound of wind and oar. Towns were raided, harbors burned, and for the first time, the people of the Emirates faced a foreign power determined to control their seas. Forts of stone began to rise along the coast, their walls pierced for cannon fire, casting shadows over villages that once belonged only to fishermen and pearl divers. Yet the people did not yield easily. Tribes of the coast resisted, striking from smaller, swifter vessels, using their intimate knowledge of the waters to harass and evade the heavy galleons. They were not alone. The Ottomans, spreading their empire eastward, also challenged Portuguese dominance. For decades, the Gulf became a chessboard of empires. Each move answered with countermove. Each fort contested, each harbor shifting hands. Still, amidst the thunder of conflict, daily life persisted. Pearls were still sought, caravans still moved, prayers still rose at dawn. The Portuguese left their mark ruins of forts can still be found, weathered and silent, standing against the tide of time. Their walls tell stories of cannon fire and foreign tongues echoing across desert air. But their grip on the Gulf was never absolute. They faced the same truth every outsider eventually discovers. The land and sea here belong not to empires, but to those who know them intimately, who have lived with their rhythms for generations. By the 17th century, another tide of Europeans arrived. The Dutch came first, their ships bearing the emblem of the Dutch East India Company, seeking spices and control of trade. Then the British, whose East India Company would, in time, weave its influence across the Indian Ocean and into the Gulf. These new powers competed fiercely, sometimes against each other, sometimes against local tribes, always seeking to secure the lifelines of commerce that flowed through these waters. For the people of the Emirates, this meant living in a world where foreign sails were a constant presence. Markets bustled with goods from further and further afield, pepper from India, fabrics from Java, weapons forged in Europe. At the same time, alliances grew more complex. Local rulers weighed choices carefully to align with one foreign power against another, or to preserve independence through resistance and negotiation. The dhows, those graceful wooden ships of the Gulf, continued to glide alongside the hulking foreign galleons. At night, when the lanterns of European ships glowed across the water, Emirati sailors would still chant their sea songs, the Nahyan's voice threading through the dark, steady as the stars. Even as cannons and treaties redrew the map, the rhythm of pearl diving endured unbroken. Families still waited on shore for the return of the fleet, still sang lullabies of longing, still strung pearls into ornaments that shimmered like captured moonlight. It was during these centuries that the reputation of the coastal tribes grew fierce. Among them, the Qawasim, based around what is now Ras, Al Khaimah, and Sharjah, became renowned for their naval strength. Their fleets of dhows, swift and agile, controlled trade routes and resisted European encroachment. To the British, these seafarers were often described as pirates. To their own people, they were protectors of the coast, guardians of their independence. The clash between Qawasim fleets and British warships would one day define much of the region's political destiny, giving rise to what Europeans later called the Pirate Coast. But for now, in these early encounters, the people of the Emirates lived in a delicate balance between tradition and intrusion, between the quiet life of the desert and the thunder of cannons from across the sea. The Portuguese forts stood for a time, their walls filled with foreign voices, but slowly, steadily, their grip loosened. The Ottomans pressed from the north, local tribes resisted from the sea, and the immense distances separating Portugal from its far-flung empire weakened its hold. By the mid-17th century, the Portuguese presence had largely retreated, leaving behind fragments of stone and stories of smoke. The Dutch and British soon filled the vacuum, their rivalry flickering across the waves like torchlight. The Dutch would not endure here for long. The British, however, would remain, weaving threads of influence that would one day bind the Emirates into formal treaties. Yet that chapter lies still ahead. For the people living along the sandy shores, the centuries of European intrusion were like a storm that passed overhead. Fierce, loud, and destructive, yet never able to wash away the roots of tradition buried deep in the soil of desert and sea. Life endured as it always had. Men dove for pearls, women tended homes and crafted textiles, children ran barefoot in the sand. And above it all, the call to prayer continued to rise, soft and unwavering, reminding all who heard it of a greater rhythm, eternal and unbroken. And so the story drifted forward into a new age, when local tribes would rise in greater strength, their sails filling with determination, their harbors echoing with chants of resistance, their names etched into the tides of history. The Portuguese storm faded, and with it, their heavy forts fell silent. What remained was not emptiness, but opportunity, for the coastlines of the Emirates had always belonged to their people. In the centuries that followed, the tribes of the region grew stronger, weaving themselves into the shifting currents of trade, alliance, and survival. Among these tribes, the Qawasim emerged as a force that could not be ignored. Their home lay around the harbors of Ras, Al-Khaimah, and Sharjah, where the mountains tumbled into the sea and the beaches stretched wide. From these shores they built fleets of dhow sleek, fast and perfectly suited to the Gulf's waters, where the Portuguese had tried to dominate with cannons and castles. The Qawasim mastered with agility and knowledge of the tides. Their ships, painted with tar, their triangular sails snapping in the wind, could swarm around larger vessels, striking swiftly before vanishing into familiar inlets and shoals. To outsiders, especially the British, who would soon fix their gaze upon these waters, the Qawasim were pirates, feared for their daring raids upon merchant vessels. But to their people, they were defenders of independence, guardians of the coast, rulers of the sea lanes that had been theirs for generations. From the late 17th into the 18th century, the Qawasim Navy was among the strongest indigenous maritime powers in the entire Gulf. Life in these years was shaped by the sea more than ever. Pearl diving reached a golden age, rising to dominate the economy of the Emirates. Every summer, when the winds shifted and the seas grew calmer, the fleets set sail. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of dhows would leave their villages, each carrying divers, haulers, captains, and singers. The departure was a spectacle of community families gathering on shore, women reciting prayers for the safety of their men, children waving as the sails disappeared beyond the horizon. The diving season was long and grueling, stretching from May into September, when the heat was at its fiercest. Out at sea, the divers followed a rhythm older than memory. At dawn, they dove, their bodies lean and scarred from years of salt and coral. A stone weight tied to a rope dragged them quickly downward, their fingers grasping at oysters on the seabed. With lungs bursting, they tugged the rope, and the hauler hauled them back, dripping and gasping. Each oyster was pried open with quiet anticipation, and when a pearl was found round, luminous, shimmering with soft light, was like uncovering a fragment of the moon. The Nahyan, the singer aboard each dhow, gave voice to the struggle and the hope. His chants carried across the deck and out over the waves, rhythmic and haunting, part prayer, part lullaby, binding the crew together through exhaustion and fear. His voice rose and fell like the tide itself. Songs of longing for families left ashore, of gratitude for safe returns, of pearls that might bring fortune. Even today, those songs are remembered, echoing in museums, whispered in festivals. Reminders of a time when music was as essential as breath to life at sea. Back on land, the pearling industry shaped society in profound ways. Wealthy merchants financed fleets and employed divers. Entire towns revolved around the trade. Markets selling ropes, sails, wooden planks for boats. Women weaving palm fronds into mats and baskets to supply the voyages. Pearls became not only jewels but currency exchanged across the Gulf, India, and beyond. For centuries, they glittered in the palaces of Persia, in the markets of Istanbul, in the courts of Europe. The rhythm of pearling became the rhythm of life. When the season ended, the fleets returned in great processions, their sails white against the horizon. Families rushed to the shore, laughter and tears mingling. Children clambering onto the boats to embrace their fathers and brothers. The catch was divided, debts paid, celebrations held. The cycle would begin again the following year, as it had for countless generations. Yet the Emirates of this era were not only defined by pearls. Inland, in the shadow of the Hajar Mountains, tribes thrived around oases and palm groves. Camels remained the lifeblood of desert life, racing across the sands, carrying goods, providing milk and meat. Poetry flourished in tents, where men recited verses of love, of bravery, of longing for rain. Hospitality remained sacred. A traveler arriving at a Bedouin camp would be welcomed with dates, coffee poured from a long-spouted dalla, and a place by the fire. The desert and the sea existed in harmony, each shaping the people's spirit. In the desert, endurance and generosity were the virtues. On the sea, courage and cooperation. Together, they forged a culture of resilience, of strength softened by poetry, of pride tempered with humility before the vastness of nature. As the 18th century wore on, however, the rising power of the Qawasim and the pearling wealth of the Amirites drew ever sharper attention from Britain. The British East India Company sought safe passage for its ships to India, and the presence of a strong, indigenous navy troubled them. Clashes grew more frequent, with Qawasim fleets striking at British and Allied ships, and British warships responding with bombardments. The Gulf became a theater of conflict once more, not against the Portuguese this time, but against the British Empire. Still, despite the thunder of these clashes, the daily lives of the people continued much as they always had. The desert was still crossed by camel caravans. The sea still glittered with pearls. The mosques still called the faithful to prayer. And in every village, under every tent, stories were told of ancestors, of battles, of the beauty of the desert night. The golden age of pearling was one of both prosperity and fragility. It bound the Emirates to the wider world with threads of wealth and trade. Yet it also drew them into the contests of global empires. The pearls shone brilliantly, but, like all things of the sea, they were vulnerable to the storms that gathered on the horizon. And soon, those storms would take form in treaties, in protectorates, in new names etched upon maps, the beginning of the era known as the Trucial States. The 19th century dawned upon the Arabian Gulf with a quiet glow of pearl divers' lamps, flickering like stars scattered upon the sea. Yet beneath this stillness, tension simmered, for the power of the Qawasim tribes had grown too visible, their fleets too strong, their independence too bold. British merchant ships, sailing from Bombay toward Basra, grew nervous when their passage brought them near Ras Al Khaimah or Sharjah. To the British, these waters seemed to teem with corsairs, though to the tribes of the Emirates it was simply defense of their own sea lanes, a continuation of a sovereignty rooted in salt and sand. The clashes intensified until, in 1819, the calm of the shorelines broke. The Royal Navy arrived in force, its cannons booming against Ras Al Khaimah. The bombardment sent smoke curling over palm groves, flames licking through the village. Forts were destroyed, dhows burned, ships scuttled along the beach. The Qawasim resistance was fierce but overpowered. In the echo of the gunfire, the balance of power shifted. The following year, in 1820, came the General Maritime Treaty, an agreement signed between the British and the rulers of the Emirates' sheikdoms. It was a treaty that demanded peace at sea no more, a tax upon British or Allied ships. In exchange, Britain pledged to recognize and protect the local rulers. It was the first time the tribes of the Emirates appeared together in a written agreement with a foreign power, their names inked in both Arabic and English, their coast labeled on maps in a new way, the Trucial Coast. From then on, the coast lived under a web of Trucism in 1835, in 1843, and finally solidified in 1853 with the Perpetual Maritime Truce. This series of treaties gave the region its enduring name, the Trucial States. To the British, these truces meant safety for their vital trade routes to India. To the rulers of the Emirates, they brought a measure of recognition, though also the long shadow of outside influence. But life for the people remained much the same. In towns along the coast, Dubai, Sharjah, Ras Al Khaimah, Al Quain, and Abu Dhabi, the rhythms of pearl diving still ruled the seasons. Wooden dhows still dotted the horizon, their white sails glowing like lanterns in the sun. In the markets, merchants traded pearls for rice, cloth, and spices, while camel caravans carried dates and dried fish inland. The treaties may have altered the language of diplomacy, but the daily texture of existence remained sewn from the same threads of desert and sea. Dubai began to emerge as a hub during this era, a settlement known for its welcoming creek that sheltered ships. In the late 19th century, Sheikh Maktoum bin Hasser Al Maktoum opened Dubai's port to merchants fleeing heavier taxes in nearby regions. Indian traders came, Persian families followed, and soon Dubai's markets bustled with goods and voices from across the Gulf and the subcontinent. The seeds of Dubai's future cosmopolitan identity were sown quietly in the smell of spices and the clink of scales in its souks. The British presence deepened over the decades, though they did not rule directly. Instead, they established a system of residencia, British political resident stationed in the Gulf, often in Bushehr or later Bahrain, keeping watch and sending reports back to London. The sheikhs retained their authority, governing their people, resolving disputes, leading pearling fleets, and tending their tribes. But foreign treaties dictated their diplomacy, binding them to Britain for protection against rivals like the Ottomans or Persians. The Trucial States era was not without hardship. The pearling industry, though glorious, was fragile. Storms could shatter fleets. Disease could spread swiftly through cramped boats. Wars or trade fluctuations could dry up markets. Still, year after year, the men dove, their lungs straining, their fingers bleeding against coral, their eyes stung by salt. And year after year, their families waited, prayed, celebrated upon their return. Travelers who visited the Emirates during this time often marveled at the resilience of its people. They described tents woven of goat hair, black against the desert sand, where coffee was poured endlessly for guests. They noted how every man carried a curved dagger at his waist, a symbol of pride. They wrote of falcons perched upon gloved hands, trained to swoop upon prey in the wide expanse of desert skies. These customs were not for spectacle, but for survival, for identity, for the quiet dignity of a people bound to their land. The desert remained a place of poetry and patience. Camel caravans traced the sands, their bells jingling softly, carrying dates and pearls inland, returning with wool, grain, and firewood. Along oases palm groves swayed, their trunks tall and straight, their fruit a gift of sustenance. Children grew up learning verses that praised the rain, the moon, the courage of ancestors. Women embroidered textiles with delicate patterns, their work adding color to the muted tones of the desert. And through it all, The treaties held fragile lines of ink across parchment, anchoring the Emirates in the great imperial currents of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Wars raged elsewhere, empires rose and fell. But here, on the Trucial coast, life endured in the cadence of the seasons. By the early 20th century, a new challenge appeared on the horizon. The world was changing, modernizing, industrializing. Steamships replaced sails, carrying pearls farther and faster. Telegraph wires crept across oceans, carrying messages quicker than caravans ever could. Yet, the greatest shift came from an unexpected rival, not another empire, but an invention: the cultured pearl. In Japan, techniques developed by Mikimoto Kokichi allowed pearls to be farmed, grown with human intervention. They were more affordable, more uniform, and soon began flooding markets that once hungered for the natural pearls of the Gulf. The Trucial States, so deeply tied to the pearling economy, began to feel the strain. The 1920s and 1930s brought hardship. Demand for natural pearls fell sharply. The Great Depression cut markets further. Many families who had relied upon pearling for generations sank into poverty. Divers took on debts they could not repay. Merchants saw their fortunes vanish. In villages along the coast, hunger deepened, yet the people endured with the same resilience they always had, sharing what little they had, finding ways to survive. It was during these lean years that the value of British protection became more pronounced. The sheikdoms, weakened by economic decline, leaned upon the treaties that promised security. Yet whispers began to rise of another treasure hidden beneath the sands, not pearls, not dates, but something black, viscous, and infinitely more powerful: oil. By the 1930s, British and foreign companies sent geologists into the Emirates, their eyes scanning the terrain, their drills probing the earth. The rulers of Abu Dhabi and Dubai signed early concessions, agreements that allowed prospecting in exchange for small sums of money. At first, the search yielded little, but hope lingered, shimmering like a mirage upon the horizon. Thus, the Trucial States era, which began in cannon smoke and treaties of peace, entered its final chapters in quiet anticipation. The pearling age was fading, the desert was whispering of new fortunes, and the future of the Emirates was poised upon the brink of transformation. And soon, in the middle of the 20th century, the black gold beneath the sand would surface, reshaping every corner of life, from the humblest tent to the grandest palace, from the smallest dhow to the tallest skyline that would one day rise. The mid-20th century arrived with an air of uncertainty along the Trucial coast. The pearling industry, once the heartbeat of the Gulf, had withered under the weight of cultured pearls and global depression. Towns that once sparkled with the trade of pearls and silk now felt quieter. Their markets less crowded, their dhows fewer upon the waters. Families struggled, yet hope lingered in whispers, hope that something hidden beneath the desert might restore prosperity. That something was oil. The search for black gold as early as the 1930s. Foreign companies sent geologists into the Trucial States, carrying strange tools, measuring sands and rock formations, searching for the ancient fossils of energy trapped deep underground. The sheikhs of Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and other Emirates signed early concessions with these oil companies, granting rights to explore in exchange for small payments. Sometimes only a few thousand rupees or pounds sterling, yet to the rulers in that time of hardship, even modest sums were welcome. But oil was elusive. Drills struck the ground, tests were conducted, but the desert remained silent. Years passed. The Second World War came and went, further delaying exploration. Yet beneath the sands, untouched reservoirs lay waiting, vast and ancient, formed over millions of years when the Arabian Peninsula was covered by seas. Then, at last, the silence broke. The first discoveries in 1958 in Abu Dhabi. Oil was struck at the Sheikh offshore field. It was not the desert that first gave up its treasure, but the sea. The following years confirmed further finds Song shore at Murban, offshore at Zakum by the early 1960s. Coal. The first shipments of crude oil were being exported from Abu Dhabi to the world. It was the beginning of a transformation so profound that the rhythm of the Emirates, the lives of its people, the shape of its cities, the very texture of daily existence would be altered forever. The wealth of oil began to flow into the hands of the ruling families. Sheikh Shakput bin Sultan Al Nahyan of Abu Dhabi, cautious and wary, was reluctant at first to spend heavily. He preferred to save, to guard the newfound treasure. But by 1966, his younger brother, Sheikh Saeed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, assumed leadership. Sheikh Saeed saw oil not merely as wealth to hoard, but as a means to transform his people's lives. With vision and compassion, he began directing oil revenues into building schools, hospitals, roads, and housing, laying the foundation for a modern nation. The winds of change in Dubai, too, would soon join the oil era. In 1966, oil was discovered offshore at the Fateh field. Sheikh Rashid bin Saeed Al Maktoum, the ruler of Dubai, had long been preparing for such a moment. He had already dredged Dubai Creek to allow larger ships to dock, positioning Dubai as a trading hub. With oil revenues, he expanded further, constructing ports, airports, and infrastructure that would set Dubai on its course toward becoming a global crossroads. Yet, Sheikh Rashid was pragmatic. He knew Dubai's oil reserves were limited compared to Abu Dhabi's vast wealth. And so, while oil funded the first wave of development, he invested heavily in trade, commerce, and later, tourism, planting the seeds of a diversified economy that would secure Dubai's future long after the wells declined. The social transformation for the people of the Emirate. The changes were dramatic. Within a single generation, lives that had once revolved around the pearl banks, the desert caravans, and the simple rhythms of subsistence were reimagined in the light of modernity. Schools were built, bringing education to boys and, gradually, to girls as well. Hospitals opened their doors, staffed at first by foreign doctors and nurses, offering care that once would have been sought only in distant lands. Roads began to stretch across the desert, where before only camels and donkeys had trod. Electricity flickered on in villages that had once known only lanterns. For many, it felt as though the world had suddenly arrived at their doorstep. Airplanes landed in new airports, bringing visitors from far-off places. Cars replaced camels as the primary mode of travel. New materials, concrete, glass, steel rose where once only palm fronds and coral stone had shaped homes. Yet amid this rapid change, traditions endured. The call to prayer still echoed from minarets, guiding the faithful. Majlis gatherings still welcomed guests with coffee and dates. Falconry, poetry, and camel racing still flourished, carrying forward the heritage of generations. Oil may have reshaped the surface of life, but the roots of identity remained anchored deep in the desert and sea. The road toward union as the oil era dawned. Another question grew urgent: the political future of the Emirates. Britain, which had signed the original treaties of protection in the 19th century, was facing its own post-war decline. By the late 1960s, London announced its decision to withdraw its military presence from east of Suez by 1971. For the Trucial States, this meant a sudden shift. The shield of British protection would vanish, leaving the Emirates vulnerable unless they found strength together. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty that Sheikh Zayed of Abu Dhabi and Sheikh Rashid of Dubai began to dream of a union, an alliance that could bind their people together, secure their independence, and guide them into the modern world. Conversations began quietly in 1968, first between Abu Dhabi and Dubai, then extending to include the other Emirates. Meetings were held in desert tents, in palaces, in majlis halls, where coffee was poured and visions for the future discussed. The question was not simple. Each emirate had its own traditions, its own ruling family, its own pride. To unite would mean compromise, trust, and shared purpose. But the tides of history were pressing the British withdrawal. The rising wealth of oil, the need for security in a turbulent region. Step by step, the path toward union began to take shape. A nation awakens. By the late 1960s, the Emirates stood at the threshold of an entirely new chapter. Oil revenues flowed like rivers through the desert, transforming barren lands into foundations for modern cities. The leaders, wise in their vision, saw that unity was the only path forward. And the people, whose lives had changed so swiftly within a generation, looked toward a future filled with possibility. The black gold beneath the sands had done more than enrich the Emirates, had propelled them into the center of a global story. From a land once overlooked as barren desert, the Emirates were emerging as a vital player in world affairs, their future shimmering like the mirages upon the horizon. And soon, in the year 1971, the dream of union would come to life, binding the Emirates together as one nation, the United Arab Emirates. The late 1960s were years of quiet anticipation along the shores of the Gulf. A subtle sense of change hung in the air, like the hush before dawn. For centuries, the tribes of the Trucial States had lived beneath the umbrella of British protection. But in January of 1968, Britain announced it would withdraw its forces from east of Suez within 3 years. The decision rippled through the desert like a sudden windstorm, unsettling, yet invigorating. For the rulers of the Emirat, the moment had come to imagine their own destiny. The desert meeting, not long after the British announcement, Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan of Abu Dhabi and Sheikh Rashid bin Saeed Al Maktoum of Dubai met quietly in the desert. Between their territories, away from the noise of the world, the sand stretched endlessly around them, the sky vast and pale, as their tents stood like ancient symbols of unity. Here, they spoke of dreams. They envisioned more than mere survival after Britain's departure. They envisioned strength, independence, and a federation that could protect their people and project stability into the future. They signed what became known as the Union Accord, a simple yet powerful commitment to create a new political framework, one that could expand to include other emirates. In this tent, with the aroma of cardamom coffee lingering in the air, the seeds of a nation were sown. The invitation to unity with Abu Dhabi and Dubai in agreement, invitations extended to the other Trucial States, Sharjah, Agman, Al Quain, Fujairah, and Ras Al Khaimah, as well as to Qatar and Bahrain. At the time, the idea was bold: a federation of 9 Arab states, small yet united, a new experiment in regional unity. Meetings followed one another, held in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, in Manama, each filled with spirited debate. The rulers discussed constitutions, responsibilities, representation. Each emirate carried its own interests, its own identity, and the negotiations were often tense. But still, the vision remained alive, flickering like a flame protected against the wind. By 1971, Bahrain and Qatar decided to pursue their own independence. The dream of 9 became 7. Yet, within the 7, commitment deepened. The Trucial States, bound by geography and history, knew their futures were intertwined. The British departure, as the clock ticked toward the end of 1971, the British departure loomed. The Sheikdoms had grown accustomed to Britain's presence, Saeed's soldiers, its treaties, its role as mediator in tribal disputes. Without that presence, the Gulf suddenly appeared as an open chessboard where larger powers might exert influence. To stand alone seemed risky. To stand together offered strength. And so, after years of deliberation, a date was chosen. On December 2nd, 1971, in Dubai, the rulers of 6 Emirates Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Sharjah, Al Quain, Ajman, and Fujairah signed a historic agreement. The United Arab Emirates was born. A day of flags. That morning, the air in Dubai shimmered with a sense of history. At the Union House, a modest yet dignified building near the shore, the rulers gathered, their white robes glowing beneath the winter sun. One by one, they placed their signatures upon the agreement, the ink flowing like the lifeblood of a new nation. Then, before the crowd, a flag was raised, flag of red, green, white, and black. Its colors, drawn from the Arab revolt, symbols of unity, sacrifice, and hope. As it fluttered in the Gulf breeze for the first time, cheers rose, and the people felt a surge of belonging. They were no longer separate emirates alone. They were one nation, the United Arab Emirates. Later, in February 1972, Ras Al Khaimah joined as the 7th and final emirate, completing the federation. The spirit of union in those early years, the federation was fragile, like a new sapling bending in the wind. The rulers had to balance autonomy with unity, tribal traditions with modern governance, rapid development with cultural preservation. But Sheikh Zayed, chosen as the first president, led with vision and patience. He was known not only for his wisdom, but for his humility, traveling the Emirates personally, listening to his people, ensuring that oil wealth was shared to build roads, schools, clinics, and housing across the federation. Sheikh Rashid of Dubai, as vice president, worked alongside him, bringing his own foresight in trade and urban development. Together, their partnership became the twin pillars of the new state. It was not always smooth. Disputes arose over revenues, over representation. Yet, each time, the rulers returned to the Majlis, to dialogue, to compromise. The culture of consensus, rooted in tribal traditions of sitting together until agreement was found, became the glue that held the young nation together. The dawn of a new era for ordinary Emirates. The changes of the 1970s were profound. Suddenly, the horizon expanded. Children who might once have worked as pearl divers or herders now found themselves in classrooms, learning science, mathematics, and languages. Women, long limited in public roles, began to access education and opportunities, slowly at first, but steadily growing. Infrastructure bloomed: airports, highways, ports. In Abu Dhabi, wide boulevards and modern buildings began to rise, where sand once lay untouched. In Dubai, the creek bustled with commerce, and Jebel Ali Port was envisioned a bold project that would one day become the largest man-made harbor in the world. In Sharjah, cultural institutions took shape. In Fujairah, the mountains echoed with new roads connecting the coast to the hinterlands. The Emirates, once seen as a quiet backwater of the Gulf, were awakening challenges and resilience. Yet these years were not without difficulty. Regional conflicts simmered. The Iran-Iraq War would soon begin. The shadow of larger neighbors loomed, and questions of identity remained delicate in a federation where each emirate held its own pride. But what bound them was stronger than what divided them. The shared vision of prosperity, the memory of hardship, and the leadership of Sheikh Zayed and his fellow rulers anchored the nation in unity. Slowly, the Emirates began to be recognized on the world stage. Embassies were established. International organizations welcomed the UAE as a member, and its flag flew in distant capitals. A country that had not existed a decade before now stood as a sovereign nation, its voice beginning to join the chorus of global affairs. A nation's first breath. Those who lived through those first years remember them as years of wonder. The sudden shift from a life of scarcity to one of opportunity, from separation to unity, from desert silence to the hum of modernity, felt almost dreamlike. The Emirates had taken their first breath as a nation, fragile yet full of promise, rooted in ancient traditions, yet reaching for a modern future. The Federation, born in 1971, was more than a political act. It was a testament to vision, to compromise, to the ability of leaders to rise above differences for the sake of their people. And it was only the beginning.